Now today we've come into the VCC to do the Churchill AVRE, and AVRE stands for Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers. It's not a tank, not in the accepted sense of the word, and that's because of the kind of gun it's got. It's a 290mm demolition charge firing gun. It's much shorter than the gun you'd find on a tank normally, and it fires a thing called a petard, although for some reason popularly the thing's known as a flying dustbin. It's an explosive charge. The thing's only got a range of about 80 yards, an effective range, but when it hits, my goodness me, that charge wrecks whatever it strikes, especially masonry, which it's mainly aimed to do, and it knocks it out. But otherwise it's a perfectly ordinary Churchill. It's a Mark III in this case, with the welded turret. The only other difference is that they've made the hatch over the machine gunner's head sliding. That's so they can load it. What they actually do is break the gun, rather like you do with an air rifle or a shotgun, for instance, to load it. You break the gun. In this case, they point the barrel up in the air, and the loader then takes the round, the petard, and shoves it up through that hatch and pushes it up into the gun until it's caught in place, and the gun then can be lowered to its normal position for firing. So that's the only other modification. Otherwise, it's a perfectly ordinary Churchill tank, powered by a Bedford 350 horsepower engine at the back, driving through a Merritt Brown transmission, and quite typically a Churchill. It's got that strange business of the loads of multiple little wheels along the side, which identifies a Churchill in particular. But it was the basis of a number of other funnies, and they're the things we want to talk about today. This is what they call the basic version with the demolition gun, but it was normally seen with a Fascine on the front. And the Fascine was a dirty great bundle of sticks. Doesn't sound very nice, but it was. And the idea was that you carried it around on the tank. When you did so, the tank had to drive with its turret to the left or right, because otherwise the Fascine got knocked about by the gun, or such as looked like a gun sticking at the front here. And that's why they ran it with the turret facing to the side. Now the Fascine was about 8 feet in diameter. It's a huge thing, and about 12 feet wide, and it was mounted on the front of the tank on a wooden cradle. And the idea was that the tank goes into action and it comes to a ditch or a trench or something like that and releases the Fascine into it. The Fascine's held in place by a huge cord that goes over the thing and down behind the turret with a quick release thing on it. And you work the quick release, that releases the wire, and the Fascine tumbles forward into the ditch. After that, the AVRE is still free to go around as it normally did with the gun and do other AVRE things. But the Fascine was what it was originally designed to carry in action. And it's quite an unwieldy looking thing. In fact, you sometimes see photographs of it balanced on the top, and although the driver can more or less see out, his view is somewhat restricted by the Fascine and by the cradle. And in those cases, the commander got on top of the Fascine. That meant he was 8 feet above the level of the tank. And he hung on for dear life and directed the driver through his loudspeaker. And that's the only way he could do it. So that's how the Fascine was used, and that's why it was used. The Fascine was probably the most common of the Funnies attachments, and it was used on these Churchill AVREs in quite large numbers. So that's the main feature of that thing anyway. What I want to talk about now is the Bobbin. It was an attachment. It came on a frame fitted to the tank. One of the things you'll notice about the AVRE is that it has these attachments on the side designed to accept these various bits and pieces that were fitted to it. Now the Bobbin came in two sorts, the Type C and the Type D. The Type C was a relatively small diameter and carried in front of the tank. The Type D was a large diameter thing, much higher. But the large diameter one, which is the one people most famously know about, it carried a roll of matting on it, and it was designed for use over the beaches, to be resistant to things like blue clay. Blue clay was a substance that tended to suck a tank down like a quicksand. If a tank or a lorry went over blue clay, it was incapable of moving any further and gradually got drawn into the blue clay. So they came up with this idea of a fabric road, because wound around the bobbin is a trackway. It's the same width as the tank. It's made of hessian with reinforcing strips of scaffolding running through it. Quite an amazing setup. And the idea was that the bobbin would be unwound as the tank went forward, and it would fall down in front of the tank until the tank was running over it, and the bobbin would stretch out, or the roadway it had laid would stretch out behind the tank. The tank would clear it, and as soon as the last bit of the roadway had fallen from the bobbin, the crew member inside could detach the bobbin from the tank. The frame came off, and they just left it lying there on the beach. It didn't make any difference. And the tank went about its business. But that's what the bobbin was. Now, the trouble with the bobbin was that this thing it had laid, this hessian roadway, tended to be rather a nuisance in wet weather, especially when the tide was coming in, because water washed it away and screwed it up, and nothing could drive over it. So it was only a very temporary measure, put down quickly to deal with the blue clay. Later on, sappers would come along and put a metal roadway over it so that the tanks could drive across more safely, and lorries as well. But this was just done as an emergency measure to start off with. It was one of the very first attachments brought out for the AVRE generally. Now, the most amazing attachment in many ways is the small box girder bridge. This was carried on the front of the tank, carried at an angle of about 60 degrees. It was a 30-foot bridge capable of carrying a 40-ton vehicle. It's pretty hefty, really, but it has an amazing effect on the AVRE. Because of this great weight of this bridge at the front, you'll find all the AVREs with the bridge attached to them are going along rather pressed down at the front, pressed down on their suspension quite a lot. And it wasn't really very easy to drive with them like that, and it looks most peculiar when you see it going along. So what they did, they came up with versions of this to try and remedy this problem. The first was an idea of actually folding the bridge in half, rather like a scissors bridge on another type of tank. And you folded the bridge in half and carried the half bridge along in front of the tank. And when you wanted to lay it, you cut the rope that was holding it, and the bridge began to come apart. And as it came apart, cables grabbed the end of it and pulled it out, stretched it out normally in front of the tank, and you laid it. The other method, which is even sillier in many ways, was to attach the bridge to the back of the tank. The bridge was fitted with 2 sets of wheels off a lorry and was towed like a trailer behind the tank. And the idea then was that you stopped when you wanted to and got another tank to bring the bridge round the front, and using the winch on the back of the AVRE, which was a particular feature of the bridge laying version, you hauled the bridge up into the launching position. But that really was one of the most impressive of the variations that you'll see. They found actually with the bridge that the people who really didn't like it were the skippers of the landing craft that brought them over. They said that the bridge stuck up too far and caught the wind and shoved the boat off course. And the helmsman didn't like it, the captain obviously didn't like it. So they used to try, if they could, to get the bridge laying Churchill as near the back of the landing craft as possible. The next attachment I want to discuss is a thing called the Bullshorn Plough. It was named Bullshorn after the bull, which was the 79th Armoured Division's main image, the sort of head of a bull. And it was carried in front of a tank. In fact, there were a whole range of these ploughs. They'd been invented and by all sorts of people over the years and tested, but the only one that was successful, or at least was used, was the Bullshorn Mark III, which was used only on Sword Beach. It wasn't as good as a flail when it came to minesweeping anyway, not at all as good. But the idea was that the Churchill tank had this frame in front of it, fitted onto the front of the tank, and it was elevatable. You had a winch inside the tank and could winch it up if you needed to. But when it was ploughing, it was quite literally an ordinary plough. It had a pair of skids at the front that the plough rested on, or the whole frame rested on, and that was to make sure that the plough itself didn't go any deeper than it was supposed to. And the idea was that as it went forward, in sand especially, it scooped up the mines and pushed them aside. What they found was that a mine exploded on a beach, made a crater which was as bad as a mine itself. So that's why they produced these plough scoops to pick the mine up and not explode it. It meant that someone had got to come along and fiddle with the mine afterwards to deactivate it, but that was a risk, and that's what you took sappers into your service for, to do that sort of thing. It's a horrible, dangerous job. But that's what the Bullshorn plough did. They were only used on Sword Beach, and only for a while. Actually, I haven't found a photo of one doing it yet. There are photos of them being tested, but not of them actually on the beach. But we know from what's written in books and reports that the Bullshorn plough was used on Sword. So that's one version which is worth remembering, although it's probably not well known. Now, the other one I want to talk about is the most peculiar thing called a Conger. It was actually done like a trailer. And the Conger was a universal carrier without its engine that was towed by the Churchill tank. And the idea was that when you came to a minefield, inside the Conger was a hose pipe, and it was all laid down, all flaked down so that it wouldn't tangle in a knot. And you had a rocket, which you fired, about a 5-inch rocket. You fired this across the minefield, and the hose went with it. And the idea was that the hose laid out between there and the carrier at the back here. Now, that was the easy bit. The difficult bit was that you pumped this hose full of nitroglycerine. Now, nitroglycerine at the best of times is a very unstable explosive, but that's what they did. They pumped a little bit of it into the hose and filled the hose up from end to end and exploded it, and by sympathetic detonation, that then cleared enough mines either side of it to enable someone to walk through with a mine detector. And it was the start of making a path wide enough for tanks to go along. The trouble was, as I say, that nitroglycerine was a lethal substance. And on one occasion, what happened was that during the operations in Northwest Europe, when they got into Holland, they came to a place called Issendijk. Or it's similar to that. Anyway, I can't pronounce it, but Issendijk is near as I can get. And they were actually unloading this stuff, this nitroglycerine, in jerry cans from a lorry, and it blew up. In the resulting explosion, both lorries, and there were 2 of them that needed unloading, both lorries disappeared completely. 4 AVREs were destroyed and 50 men were killed, plus the inhabitants of a nearby farmhouse, apparently, engulfed by the explosion. It was a tremendous business and not very pleasant. But that's something that it finished the Conger. The Conger was never used again afterwards because it was deemed to be too dangerous. But that was the real risk of using nitroglycerine. They changed to another substance which was much less volatile and less likely to go off. But that is a saga that is hardly known. It's hardly been mentioned at all, that explosion at Issendijk, and yet they've got a memorial there, and they're thinking of getting a replica Conger made to show people what it looked like. Ghastly, blessed thing. But that was the other version of this a modification of the AVRE. Now, there are a load of others. I could go on talking about them for weeks on end if I wanted to, but I'm afraid you'll all die of boredom. So I'm going to stop there. The only 2 that I want to talk about now are the Churchill ARK and the Churchill Bridgelayer. Now, unfortunately, we haven't got examples to show you of either one of these, nor were they, in fact, a version of the AVRE. But they were on turretless Churchill chassis, and therefore we're going to use this tank to talk about them. Now the Ark was the simplest of all. It was a turretless Churchill with a pair of ramps, one either side, which carried another tank. And the idea was that you drove the Ark up against a wall or into a gap, and it formed a sort of self-propelled bridge that another vehicle could go over. Now, I've never seen any evidence of Arks being used on D-Day. They do say they were, but I've never seen it. So, but they are interesting vehicles, and they had a number of them. Later on, they built a Mark II version with longer ramps at each end, which was used inland to fill ditches and to bridge small rivers. They may have had one or two of those over in France, but I've never seen pictures of them. They were used a lot in Italy and became quite famous out there, and you do see pictures of them being used, but never in Northwest Europe as far as I can see. But that was the Ark. The Ark, by the way, you'll find lots of people referring to it as the Armoured Ramp Carrier. That's a load of tripe, as far as I'm concerned. You don't spell carrier with a K to begin with anyway. Another thing that's been explained to me is that the Ark was short for the Ark of the Covenant because the general in charge was very religious, and I don't believe that either. But I have been told that the Ark was an abbreviation for Ark Royal, HMS Ark Royal, the aircraft carrier, because the tank version of an Ark had a flat top, and that was the nickname usually given to carriers. Just it was done as an abbreviation of the name of the ship anyway, and that appears to be the reason that they were called Arks. There's no other logical reason at all. The final one I want to talk about is the Churchill Bridgelayer. Now the Churchill Bridgelayer comes about midway through the war and is quite effective. It uses the number 2 tank bridge. It's a 30-foot tank bridge carried on a central pivoting arm, and the idea is that the tank, using hydraulics, can lift up the bridge, move it forward and lay it in front of itself, with the bridge never turning over or doing anything. The bridge stays horizontal the whole time, from leaving the tank to being laid in front of it. It will take a 40-ton tank. It's incredibly tight fit, so it means another tank going over it is more or less touching the edges anyway, and you see photographs of them doing this. It must have been quite a nerve-wracking experience for the driver. But the Churchill Bridgelayer was known as the Jumbo, that was its nickname, and it was an impressive-looking vehicle. But unfortunately, we don't have one here anymore. I think you can see one at the Royal Engineers Museum, but not here. But that was quite an impressive bit of kit as well. And those two, although they're not really part of the AVRE story, have been included because they are Churchill-based.